Okay, property offences. The AIC has done a lot of work on bushfire arson and the prevention of bushfire arson. A report was released by us at the start of 2009, just before the Black Saturday fires, and whilst that was a horrendous event and tragedy for our Victorian community, for us it actually meant there was a lot of pardon me, a lot of prominence on our work at that particular point. And so that's work we are very proud of, and which has led to us doing a range of other projects on bushfire arson since those times. We're engaged at the national level with the Attorney General's bushfire forums. We work with academic agencies to look at bushfire arson and typology, if you like, or profile of offenders. And we continue to do this work, and I'll show you a really nice graphic later as to how we can look at bushfire arson. Robbery, clearly it's a property offence. Firearms theft and firearms trafficking are areas we also have been working on for the last 4 or 5 years, and will continue to do so. With transnational crime and organised crime is a big area for us. We have a very large program devoted to financial crime, looking at fraud issues, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing. That's become an area of great interest for us, and we have some of the leading experts in the country based here. Russell Smith, who will be closing today's events in particular, is a well-known expert in financial crime. High-tech and electronic crime, online grooming for sexual offence purposes, the importance of addressing malware and other sort of technological glitches or attempts to sort of undermine electronic media is really important. And again, we have a leading expert there, Raymond Chu, who will, I think is also talking about his work today. Again, it's an idea where we actually picked up on an emerging trend, if you like, in criminal behaviour involving the electronic media. And we expect to be working in this area for the future. So we do try and identify the emerging trends in crime and to try and address those as we can. Human trafficking, not just sex workers and trafficking for sexual purposes, but also for labour trafficking. We've got a very large human trafficking program. It's been going for 3 years, and we hope to continue that on. At the moment, we're in the field with a very large survey of using the Scarlet Alliance, which is a sex worker collective, to do some research with interviewing prostitutes to look at their immigration status, issues they've had with migration, and issues around sexual trafficking, which is really important. We're also doing some work analysing cross-border crime patterns with a number of Commonwealth law enforcement agencies, and what that essentially means is it can be a local level whereby people living in New South Wales are actually coming to ACT to commit crimes and going home at night. Or it could be, for example, the same thing happening where a Victorian is going to New South Wales committing crimes and going home. What does that mean in terms of the jurisdictional responses? How do we deal with that? And what's the size of the problem? And so that involves us basically crunching through very large data sets to identify trends in criminal behaviour. So that's a very important project, I think, as well. Okay, illicit substances and substance misuse, another big area for us. We're running the Drug Use Monitoring Australia monitoring program. That's one of only about 3 or 4 similar programs in the world, and what it essentially evolves in, across 8 police stations located in all sorts of parts of Australia. Interviewers go into police stations and try to interview every police detainee who's in custody and ask them questions about their drug use, their alcohol use, prior criminal history, and to get some background as to why they're actually in that police centre at that point. We also ask the detainees to give a urine sample, and to date we've had 70% of detainees will actually provide information and give a urine sample, which means we can test for the drug use and what's in their systems, and we can also of course hear from them as to what their drug use is about, get some intelligence on what sort of drugs are out there, and hopefully provide policy advice on how that might be addressed. It fits very nicely into a broader strategic intelligence framework for police. That's a very big program. It costs a lot of money to run, and it has been going now for over 10 years, and we hope to expand it in the short term. We're also involved in creating performance measurement frameworks for illicit drugs, like how do you actually measure making a success or having a success around reducing the level of drug use or the level of illicit drugs in the community with police services. That's important for us. And we've also got a really interesting project which actually models and forecasts how various drug markets in Australia interact with each other. So, for example, is the drug market in Western Australia linked to the one in Queensland? If so, how? If there's a seizure at the border in Queensland around cocaine, does that affect the heroin trade in Victoria? And surprisingly, there's some quite interesting links between the various drug markets and across different drug types. And that also is really important intelligence for police services, which we probably wouldn't ever publish because it's a bit too sensitive, but it's important stuff. Criminal justice responses are pretty much a bread and butter issue for us. We want to try and improve the system and how the police, the courts, and any therapeutic jurisprudence approaches actually do work to give an effective response to crime and to criminal behaviour. One element of that is the deaths in custody and the police custody surveys, which are monitoring reports that we do regularly. The deaths in custody came about through the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody many years ago, back in about 91 I think. And essentially they asked us to do a regular annual report of the number of deaths in custody with a particular focus on the number of Aboriginal people who are dying in custody from various causes. The next report of that series is due out in about, I think next week actually. So you might want to keep your eyes out for that. Police custody is a 5-yearly survey we do. We do it every 5 years. And essentially it covers off who's been in custody, the demographics of those people and issues around how they're treated. That also is an important survey which is very useful for police services. We've done a number of specialist court evaluations like the Koori Court in Victoria, the Murray Court in Queensland, and if you like, trying to evaluate approaches that have tried to sort of divert groups of offenders into a more therapeutic approach to criminal justice. That's been particularly helpful, I think, in identifying what works and what doesn't. We've been involved in prisoner recidivism analyses, which is essentially a number crunching exercise, trying to work out who's going to recidivate and how often. We're involved in looking at best practice in designing and operating women's prisons, and also in planning community safety events and evaluating the community safety plans for a number of communities in the Northern Territory, which Matthew will probably talk about in some sense. A big theme which we've got is not just about reducing crime and intervening to make sure the criminal justice system works most effectively, is to look at how we can prevent crime in the first place. That's essentially, it underlines everything we do. We want to actually prevent crime from ever occurring if we can. Now we do this a number of ways. Apart from the fact that it's a theme for most of our work, and we will find that in our policy recommendations, we also do it through a capacity building focus. In other words, trying to assist agencies to ramp up their game in some sense, whether it be through evaluation, performance measurement, strategic intelligence or use of strategic intelligence, or by providing an analysis function such that we inform the work they're doing. An example would be the Victorian Parliamentary Drugs and Crime Prevention Committee. We've had an ongoing contract with them where they ask for certain things to be done around particular sets of criminal justice data, and we'll analyse it for them and give them an interpretation, which is an important role for us, and it actually informs the work that they do about making recommendations on how to address drug use issues. We're also, over the last 30 years, from time to time, the AIC has been involved strongly in education and training opportunities, and that's a theme that's coming up again at the moment, whereby we're doing a lot more work now on trying to link to crime prevention and evaluation training. And what does that mean? Well, what we do is we try to create a few how-to manuals or some training programs or some workshops on how you actually prevent certain crime groups and how you might evaluate the work that's being undertaken to make sure you can get a real idea of whether it works or not. So 2 examples here. How do you prevent bushfire arson? The how-to manual we've created, or the handbook that we've created, talks about how you set up a local community committee, how you involve the police and fire agencies, the data you might want to access, how you interpret the data, and how you might use that to create intervention. Similarly with CCTV, we're hoping to put a report out shortly which talks about how CCTV systems work. What's the best way to make them work? Are they effective? How can we sort of improve their effectiveness? I think that's important too. Again, a theme I've already talked about a little bit is performance measurement and evaluation. We're very keen, firstly, to do good quality evaluations of interventions ourselves or court programs or legislation, but we also want to give back to the field to actually ramp up agencies' ability to actually do their own evaluations and or to create their own crime prevention interventions and to put them in the field in a productive and useful way. So in this area we'll look at things like assisting law enforcement agencies around making better use of strategic intelligence on illicit drugs or something else. Or perhaps we might work with customs, for example, looking at issues around how they can make the best use of their the border seizures the information about border seizures that they make during the year. We've talked about specialist court evaluations. We'll do that sort of thing as well and try and work with the courts to create more effective systems, etc., etc. So that's a big theme for us. Now, last theme, modelling and forecasting crimes. Again, it's a number crunching exercise. I'll talk about our development of abilities and I guess skills in a minute. But at the moment we're doing a lot of work around hardcore statistical modelling and framing of various crimes and trying to predict future criminal behaviour. That's become a really big thing for us in the last year. So we'll look at cross-border crime patterns, predicting whether a future number of criminals or prisoners will go up in particular jurisdictions based on information around particular crime types. We'll look at drug networks, how they work, how they interact, and how we can actually reduce the issues of supply or have an impact on reducing the availability of drugs in particular networks and what the impact might be across the country. We'll also look at the cost of organised crime. How much does organised crime cost the Australian community? That's quite a complex project, but it's one we're working on now. So very quickly, I know it was quick, and you'll hear a lot more about this during the day. That's essentially what we've been doing in the last few years, and what we expect we'll be continuing to do over the next few years as well. How we tend to work is we try and do like long-term, sort of large-scale projects that will add value to the field as a whole, like, big issues around fraud, for example, or around homicide. The AIC also has to be ready to respond to demands, though, by governments or key agencies that may emerge out of nowhere or which may emerge with very little notice. And overseas student victimisation is a good example of that, whereby, as you know, there was a lot of media around a number of attacks on Indian students in different parts of the country. And essentially, very quickly, there was a recognition that there needed to be some sort of research on the nature and extent of victimisation of Indian and also other overseas students in Australia. And the problem was the police weren't really recording reliable data on the race and student status of crime victims. So it was a real issue. You couldn't really get that data easily. We managed to identify a number of options we could pursue, and the Australian government then tasked us with the support of the state territories to undertake a national estimate of victimisation for overseas students. And I'll talk briefly about where we're up to with that. I'm not going to give results today because we haven't got any, and they're not ready for release yet anyway. So we came up with a three-stage project. The first one was, what could we find that already existed from ABS data, from our own internal holdings? What could we find that might give us some idea of whether overseas students are being victimised greater than would be expected compared with the rest of the Australian population or the Australian student population? And that's something we've been looking at right now. There aren't that many data sets around, I can tell you that much. Now, phase two, which is our bigger project, was, okay, what could we do then to try and get access to police records and try and identify student victims? Police weren't doing it themselves, how could we do it? So with the support of the Department of Immigration, a number of other Commonwealth law enforcement bodies, and with the state territory police agencies, it was agreed that we would cross-reference the names of 500 student visa record holders for students from India, China, South Korea, USA and Malaysia, who are our biggest student providers at the moment, for the last 5 years, and we try and take their names and their date of birth and their student status, and we would try and access that through the police records of all the states and territories to try and identify them as victims, not as offenders, as victims. And that's actually a project we've actually got underway now. It required, obviously, ethical approval. It required a Privacy Commissioner determination for the Commonwealth Privacy Commissioner. It required a lot of negotiation with the states and territories to get them to give us access to that information. And essentially how it's going to work is, or how it has been working is, we aren't involved at the early parts of the process. What happens is the Department of Immigration comes up with their student visa IDs, and they give them to the police services. We don't see their names. The police runs them through their databases and come up with a de-identified data set, and that is provided back to the AIC once it's been cleaned, and then we get to them start playing with that and trying to work out rates of overseas student victimisation for the 5 groups that were identified there. And then at the end of the day, we'll then try and compare that with the rate of victimisation for Australian students. And we'll have a focus on violent crime in particular. Now, that's a work in progress. We've got data from some agencies coming in now, and I would expect by the end of the year we'll probably have some sort of answer. Now, when that comes out, it's not I can't really determine that at this point in time, but I think it's going to be an important project which will actually help give us a better feel for what's going on nationally in terms of overseas student victimisation. We've also proposed a phase 3, which is essentially doing a national crime victimisation survey focusing on our Australian migrant populations more broadly, but also overseas students specifically. And potentially we may also create a national monitoring program on overseas students' victimisation, so we can annually we'll start checking whether the rates go up or down once we actually start calculating the rates. That's proposed. We're seeking funding to run that survey and that monitoring program, and we'll see what happens based on, I guess, on what happens with phase 1 and phase 2.